right. Welcome everyone. Just give us a little bit more time to get the room filled up and then we'll get started.
Wish my students were this enthusiastic about Zoom.
Welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel titled America the Unexceptional, the Foreign Policy the American People Want. My name is Trevor Thrall. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a transpartisan think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move US foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. The idea of American exceptionalism and the worldwide military dominance that often comes with it has long been seen as an untouchable third rail of US politics. But polls, including those by the Eurasia Group Foundation and Chicago Council, show a very interesting trend. Americans, and particularly young Americans, are increasingly skeptical of the idea that America is exceptional or needs to police the world. Why do Americans now want to be more like other countries? And what does this mean for the changing electorate mean for the future of US foreign policy? American exceptionalism does not necessarily need to bring about a foreign policy or a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, but can a grand strategy of primacy and liberal hegemony survive and prevail without a sense of exceptionalism? And will this trend add away from exceptional, add additional pressure on a Biden administration to do a deeper rethink of American foreign policy? To address these very important questions, we have an excellent panel that will be moderated by no other than Trevor Thrall from the CATO Institute. For all of those of you who are joining via Zoom, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask your question. If you are watching this on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, please add your questions in the comment section and we will try to get to those throughout the conversation as well. So with no further ado, please welcome Trevor, who will introduce the panel and kickstart the conversation. Trevor?
Trita, thanks so much. Great to be here. Thanks to everybody on Zoom and elsewhere who's tuning in. This is a great time to have what I think is one of the most important conversations we could be having right now. And so let me just quickly introduce my fellow panelists. Mark Hanna, Senior Fellow at the Eurasia Group Foundation and lead author of that foundation's 2020 report, Diplomacy and Restraint, the worldview of American voters. Dina Smeltz, Senior Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and lead author of their 2020 report, Divided We Stand, Democrats and Republicans Diverge on Foreign Policy. And Stephen Wertheim, Deputy Director of Research and Policy at the Quincy Institute, and the author of a fantastic new book, Tomorrow the World, The Birth of US Global Supremacy. Welcome, guys. Glad to be able to have some time to talk with you guys about your work. I've read your wonderful reports, Mark and Dina, of course. And so I'm glad we're going to be able to talk with a larger audience about them today. And since your data is really the star of the show in many ways today, I'd like for you guys to just take a few minutes each and tell us about, just some of the sort of top sort of key surprises, findings, themes from your reports, and then we'll just really dig into some conversation. Mark, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Trevor, and thank you to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft for hosting this for this event. I've been an attendee at several of your panels and always find them rewarding and enlightening, and hopefully we'll meet the mark here with this. So the major finding from our study this year is the main goal of our finding, and is that American voters are we found in this is the third year we're doing this, and every year we find that the American voters are less interested in a kind of military overreach and a reflexively interventionist foreign policy than and less of a traditional internationalist foreign policy than many in the Beltway, and so there's this deviation from this kind of mindset that sees America's role in the world to be, supreme, to use a term Stephen would use, or to be sort of dominant or hegemonic. And so but we didn't want to just simply leave it at that, right? There are a lot of organizations that ask about American engagement, and we wanted to be more specific and more dive deeper into what kind of engagement Americans want and what kind of engagement they don't want, because we believe in a democracy. You don't want to. The role of expertise is really important, for sure. But in a democracy that's predicated on the popular will or the consent of the governed, we think it's important to take public opinion seriously. So let's just say that. And I know Dina does as well. And anybody who spends time looking at these surveys and devising and fielding these polls takes public opinion seriously. And that's a starting point. We need to do more of that, I think, in Washington, especially when it comes to national security and foreign policy. And one of the main findings is, we basically created a 2x2 typology. We primed our respondents by giving a quick summary of the amount of troops we have overseas, or the spending that we do militarily, and the security commitments that we have. And then we ask them, should we do more or less when it comes to security and military stuff? And then for diplomacy, we mentioned some of the activities, and again, we tried to prime in both directions. So we erred on the side of balance rather than neutrality, and then asked them, they want more or less diplomacy in the world? And so we kind of created this 2x2 typology, and they're all, as an academic, typologies can conceal as much as they reveal sometimes. But instead of just saying more or less engagement, we found that traditional internationalists want the United States to maintain a strong and military presence in the world, provide for the sort of global security, and at the same time do a lot of diplomacy. Those weren't. We didn't find as many traditional internationalists among the broader population as we did what we call global ambassadors. We want more diplomacy, less military activity, less military intervention, fewer security commitments, less of a footprint overseas of American service members. And then we had the least popular of all options was the hard power primacists, which is a label we gave to people who want to do more militarily but think our diplomacy is maybe not valuable, or for whatever reason want less diplomacy. And then the genuine isolationists, people that want to do less in the world, both militarily and diplomatically. And that's a problematic term in general because it can be oversimplified, but that's what you've got. So the plurality of voters, and this was a popular option among Republicans, Democrats, Biden supporters, Trump supporters, were these kinds of global ambassadors, people who wanted to do more diplomatically. We also saw more than 70% of voters of our respondents wanted to re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement. UN, Human Rights Commission, close to 70% wanted to. Again, this is Republicans, Democrats, Independents. Close to 70% wanted to re-enter the JCPOA. Many more people thought the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran had made America less safe than thought it had made it more safe. Many more people supported I think by a 6-1, Americans support the details of the agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban that would end the war there by May 1st. So on issue after issue, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, throughout the conversation, American voters are, aligned in this general sort of outlook. Now, I'm sure Dina's going to talk about some of the ways in which Democrats and Republicans diverge, and we certainly found divergence in our findings as well that we can talk about, specific issue areas that have been perhaps become sort of polarized, and kind of third rails of the media narratives here. But in general, we find Democrats and Republicans alike, both in a plurality of both Biden and Trump supporters, believe that peace is best achieved and sustained by, quote unquote, keeping a focus on the domestic needs and health of American democracy and avoiding unnecessary intervention beyond the borders of the United States. That was the most popular answer option, more than democracy promotion, more than maintaining a strong deterrent military, peace through strength. it's keeping the needs and the focus on the domestic priorities and avoiding unnecessary intervention. So that was kind of the biggest takeaway for us.
All right, thanks. That's fantastic. And you pivoted perfectly, because I think Dina is probably going to tell us a little bit more about polarization and division. So Dina, take it away.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Trevor. So I want to echo what Mark said. Thank you so much to the Quincy Institute and to Responsible Statecraft for hosting us today. So the Chicago Council has been doing surveys for over 40 years. And this year, because it was an election year, yeah, we focused a lot on partisan differences, which is hence the title, America Divided. And basically found that in general, the areas of agreement among Democrats and Republicans were in the broad contours of where they want American foreign policy to go. For example, they support an active role for the United States in world affairs, as they have for 40-something years. They continue to support alliances and developing relationships with allies, and they continue to support free trade. Where they start to differ is when we looked at overall orientations, and these seem to have been cemented by the COVID crisis, but have existed, we've found it in other past surveys as well, that Democrats tend to favor working within the international community, giving a higher role to international organizations, and working with other countries to solve global problems, where Republicans tend to support a more self-sufficient, self-reliant type of foreign policy. They have a lot of suspicion towards the United Nations. A lot of that goes back to the Iraq War. And they do not want a greater role for international organizations. Part of that is a sovereignty issue and independence issue. And again, we have seen these in past surveys, so this isn't something new, but when we asked about it in the context of the COVID crisis, what were the lessons learned? Democrats and Republicans largely fell into these two orientations. What you had asked, what was really surprising, Trevor, one thing that really popped out to us in the data was how different Republicans and Democrats today view the top threats to American security. Democrats see the COVID crisis as the #1 threat, followed by climate change, racial inequality, and economic inequality as well. And Republicans do not see COVID as one of the top 5 threats. They see the top threat as China, and China followed by terrorism and immigration. And we recently conducted an elite survey, which is a survey of academics and think tankers, and also some business leads, people in Congress, staffers, executive branch, basically foreign policy opinion leaders with the University of Texas, Texas National Security Network. And they surprisingly also follow along these same lines, that the Republican elites are more likely to say COVID is the top threat. I'm sorry, Republican elites more likely to say that China is the top threat, where COVID is for the Democrats. So that was surprising. But then because their threats are so different, there's a big partisan nature to who thinks the government is currently handling these threats effectively, with Republicans saying the federal government is doing a decent job, where Democrats on every issue think, a majority of Democrats say that the government is doing an ineffective job. And this seems to feed into their view that the United States is no greater than other countries in the world, where Republicans tend to say that the United States is, because of its unique nature, the greatest country in the world. This has always been the case since we've asked this question since 2012 for Republicans, but Democrats, we've seen a steady decline and then a dramatic drop over this past year. So that was why Mark and I wrote a piece together in The Hill that really highlighted this large dramatic shift from previous surveys, but especially among Democrats.
Yeah. So that I think, obviously the title of the event has picked up on that theme. And so I definitely want to push you guys on that. First, though, let me encourage our audience to use the Q&A function to start giving us questions, and I will work to pick out the very best questions. So bring the heat. At this point, though, Stephen, why don't you jump in and sort of tell us, from your sort of 30,000 foot view, when you read these surveys and you've just taken in a crazy election, been writing about this now, what are your takeaways?
Sure. Good to be with everyone this afternoon. One of the things I'm just struck by are some of the margins on these questions, which are, strong support, in some cases left and right, for things that are anathema in Washington, D.C. The 6-1 margin about ending U.S. involvement in the war in Afghanistan by the end of April is just incredible. And so there's a conventional wisdom in the town behind me that one of the few things that the party leadership agrees on these days is maintaining U.S. Endless wars and U.S. military dominance globally. But there's also a common complaint about polarization and dysfunction in our own political system. I would say that the data suggests an opportunity for those who really do care about bridging some of the divides. When you have 70% margins on something, that should be something that political leaders and entrepreneurial political representatives on either side of the aisle want to take and run with. It's actually popular with voters, really popular. And I think that is reflected in some of the newer members of Congress, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, if they've been elected recently and have been in touch with the pulse of their districts, they tend to have a different point of view. You just take a look at incoming Congressman Jamal Bowman, who ousted Eliot Engel, who is the head of the Democratic leader on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. The other thing I think is that this trend about declining belief in exceptionalism in particular, it's been going on, as Mark and Dina mentioned, for some time. I think it is likely to continue. It's likely to continue because of the generational split. Younger generations and we actually see this going back in several generations. Each successive generation is less and less likely to say the United States has a unique character that makes it the greatest country in the world and justifies, the projection of American power globally. And so that is a really significant thing. The more there is polarization, the more Americans look to their own daily lives and don't think that they're better off than others in Europe or East Asia and elsewhere. I think that is a really enduring trend. But the foreign policy implications could be manifold. They're not totally clear. My preference, and I think that of a lot of people, especially on the Democratic side, who are featured in these polls, is the United States to couple military restraint with diplomatic engagement in the world. But what's curious is that although Republicans at the grassroots seem to say that they believe in American exceptionalism the strongest, their president ran for president openly rejecting American exceptionalism. Not a whole lot of people noticed or wanted to notice at that time. And whether, not only did he reject the term exceptional, he said, "I don't like the term." That's a quote. But his whole presentation of the case was that the United States, far from offering a model to the world in some fashion, had actually been viciously exploited by the rest of the world. Now it was time for the United States not to propagate its model, not even to be a beacon of light to others if they wish to follow the US example, but to turn the tables. And so what I think he offered was a kind of non-exceptionalist American nationalism that was actually more innovative than what people on the left had been able to come up with. And that's resulted in a schizophrenic foreign policy of attempts to draw down militarily in some respects, but get tougher with other countries and entities in the world, China in particular. And so I think as we move into a kind of post-exceptionalism terrain for American foreign policy, it's going to be really complicated for us to try to understand conceptually what the different implications are for American foreign policy, and then translate that understanding into polling questions that can get at how these overall frameworks relate to particular policy questions. So I'll go ahead and leave it there.
And let me, that's a lot of good insight there, Stephen. And let me pick up a couple of questions from the Q&A that popped up as soon as you started talking, but that you then didn't realize it, but you were emphasizing. So Linda asks, is there a meaningful distinction between disbelief in American exceptionalism and a leaning toward isolationism? And Norbert asks similarly, does this mean a new policy of US isolation, and how is this going to affect transatlantic relations, and so on and so forth? And I think, Dina and Mark, that's kind of a softball for you guys, because I don't think you intended to suggest that at all. So.
Yeah, I'll kick it off and just say, no, I don't think that, most of the people we polled had a definite opinion of what America should be doing in the world. And it wasn't necessarily that, the United States should retreat into the borders of the continental United States. I think that there's a recognition among most of our respondents that we are living in a globalized world, that there needs to be a certain kind of economic, diplomatic, and to some extent military connection or cooperation with the world. I think that the erosion of this belief in exceptionalism, as we wrote in the piece, Dina and I, isn't necessarily, or shouldn't be interpreted as a kind of crisis of confidence, but rather a correction for a level of overconfidence that the United States had, and a sense of the fact that our mission was somehow divinely ordained, or that we were exempt from the usual rules of engagement, or the usual values that should be governing the behavior of other countries, because we alone can fix it, right? There's a sense that, like, if the United States removes its troop presence, or if the United States tries to transfer its allies in East Asia to providing for more regional security, that somehow there's going to be a power vacuum, and that if we're not there, there's a jungle is going to grow back, or a vacuum will be created. And there's an egocentrism within that, I think, that is unfortunate, because it says, it suggests that if we're not there to fix the world's problems, then nobody else will. And I think that is a somewhat narcissistic view. At the same time, I don't think that, I'm from reading our data and from reading Dina's report, which is fantastic, I don't get the sense at all that Americans want to simply disengage, wholesale in global affairs. We're living in a very interconnected, interdependent era, and what we do and what others do has repercussions. Dina, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. Yes. We're often asked the question about isolationism, because every couple of years it seems to be a meme around the policy community. Americans want to be isolated; they don't want to be involved in world affairs. We've always found a majority wanting to be involved in world affairs. And in fact, a question that I really like is we ask about, would you like the United States to have a dominant leadership role, a shared leadership role, or no leadership role? And no more than 10% ever say no leadership role. Our question is, the wording is, some people say the United States has a unique character that makes it the greatest country in the world. Others say every country is unique and the United States is no greater than other nations. So it measures, we call it the exceptionalism question, but that's really the Beltway kind of concept that we just use to describe it. I think in this case, our results, it's really, if you look at the data, it's hard to ignore that there is a sharp partisan factor, because 80% of Republicans say we are the greatest country. And that has really not changed over time since 2012, where Democrats, only 35% say we're the greatest country. And that was 63% in 2012. This isn't all a partisan factor, because it did drop between 2012 and 2014 when Obama was still president. But I think this year for Democrats, again, looking at the way the country has handled, I mean, this survey was conducted in July, so much was going on with the COVID crisis, but also the protests about George Floyd and the looting and things that happened along with that. It was a period where I think a lot of people didn't feel proud, or that the United States looked like a role model to many other countries. So I do want to pick up on what Stephen said, that in terms of the implications for American foreign policy and the results of this question, they are not clear. When my colleague and I, Craig Kafur, were looking really closely at all the data and all the relationships, we do see a relationship between those who think the United States is not the greatest country in the world and a desire to be more engaged in international organizations and working with the international community. We didn't see as much of a tie to the support for the use of force in particular scenarios, while the last time we asked about the Afghan war, which wasn't in this past year, but when we asked about support or opposing withdrawal of troops, a majority did support it. And our data do show that a majority even support the reduction of troops from Germany. But in terms of defending allies, we haven't really seen any drops that are significant, that are related to this particular question. We saw a drop or two in a certain case, but it was, I think, because of other items, which we can talk about if you're interested in. But yeah, so it wasn't a clear correlation between what we do in terms of military interventions. So I think you're right, it's unclear. I think it'll be interesting next year to see if the results change and how much of it is a partisan factor and how much of it is due to something else. Like you both said, there's a strong age cohort difference. Younger Americans are certainly much more less inclined to buy into this idea.
Yeah. So at the risk of asking a maybe too complicated question, I'm going to string together a few different questions from our audience and add my own twist. There are, people questioning some of the results in the survey because they see that answers to hypothetical questions about the use of force, for example, don't seem to match up with what happens when we actually go do stuff. So when a Democratic president actually goes and uses military force, the answers in reality look different than what they might look like in a hypothetical thing where it looks like Democrats are the peaceniks. And so that's a pretty common thing in polling, to see the difference when you actually attach a real president to a question, the answers all of a sudden get very different. And Dina, I know, and Mark too, over the last few years of the Trump administration, we have seen what you might call the Trump effect. So there seems to be even more than normal amounts of Democratic boomeranging from positions or embracing certain positions, almost because Trump is espousing the other side of things. And so one question I think you can reasonably ask is, how much of what we've seen the last couple of years in particular is temporary and going to kind of go away when things go, and I'll use back to normal in air quotes very, carefully, but as things recede, are we going to see some coming back down? That's part A of this question. I'll bring part B up later, but let me ask you guys that question. How do you see the difference between sort of this hypothetical stuff and maybe the Trump stuff as it's actually been out in the real world?
I'll take a first step. So I think yes, there certainly could be an effect. I think on a question like the one we were talking about, the US being greater than other countries, for sure, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a shift in the next year because of partisan differences. The use of force questions are interesting. The Democrats have so let me back up. most of the items on the use of force are very stable with what we found over the past couple of years, and are higher, I think, than people would expect. And they are hypothetical. In a real world scenario, messaging would come from both sides of the argument and could impact either one. The only place we really saw a big shift in the use of force this year was on, and it's not even a big shift, and that it was on, would you support or oppose the use of US troops coming to defend a NATO ally in the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia, if Russia invaded? So what happened this year, in the last few times we've asked it, a narrow majority have supported it, and that was pretty much the same across Republicans and Democrats. Now only 47% of Republicans support it, and 56% of Democrats do. So, and then we have a question about NATO, commitment to NATO. And while Republicans still support the US commitment to NATO, it's 25 percentage points lower than Democrats. So this is an example of it is probably a Trump effect, a messaging effect from the president. Depends where the party goes, once Trump leaves office, and whether they continue to criticize allies like they have. It seems to have a bit of traction on it. So we'll have to see, but yeah, it's a great question. We're all going to be watching the numbers to see how much of an impact this has, but I think it's telling how messaging can really influence public opinion. And like I said, in two different ways. And I have also seen questions where one year we asked about the Afghan troops, whether they should be withdrawn by a certain deadline, they should be kept in place for a little bit longer, or whether special forces should be kept in there to train their intelligence services and try to work on some counterterrorism stuff, and we find different responses. We've also found different responses to the Iran agreement, depending on when we asked it, when it was before 2015, the idea of the Iran agreement, versus around the time when it was being harshly debated. And then in the last time we asked about the Iran agreement, 53% of Republicans supported it. So it depends where the messaging is a lot of the time, and how you word the question too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and the longer the war in Afghanistan drags on, I mean, in the past year, the people who are already a minority who suggest the U.S. should maintain a presence in Afghanistan until quote unquote all enemies are defeated, plummeted and dropped in half, in fact. And I think that is to some extent some Republicans coming on board with this peace deal that was negotiated by Khalilzad and under during the Trump presidency. Certain questions about which we would expect potentially some partisan shift right now when it came to war powers and whether the president should be required to seek authorization from Congress and basically getting rid of AUMF. 90% of Biden supporters said yes, the president should be required, and only 51%, still a majority of Trump supporters, thought that. One imagines that, again, I think that there is overwhelming, I think 70%, and when you include unaffiliated voters and independents, still there's overwhelming public support for Congress reasserting its constitutionally given role to declare war. But that's going to be shifting likely depending on who's president. And we did see, ideas of American exceptionalism are tiny among Democrats during a Trump presidency. I know that Dina's broken that question down as well, and Democrats are generally less bullish on exceptionalism than Republicans. We broke our exceptionalism question down to the United States is exceptional because of what it represents, of what it has done for the world, or not exceptional. In fact, every country has traits which distinguish it, but ultimately acts within its own interest. This year, the not exceptional was pretty much, neck and neck with, 2 percentage points difference with exceptional for what it represents. Very few respondents actually choose as a first sort of a preference or first statement with which they identify we're exceptional for what we've done in the world. And that is interesting. I get that these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive categories, and we can talk about the methodology in these surveys and why we did what we did. But we also, again, like that question it breaks down by generation more in a much more pronounced way than it does by partisanship. The younger you are, the less likely you are to think the United States is an exceptional nation. Part of that probably comes from not having lived through the victory of the Cold War or the sort of heady successes from World War II. And the older you are, the more likely you are to think we're exceptional for what we've done for the world. So again, it's just what has the United States done in the past 50 years or 20 years? Most Americans don't think that creates to a kind of exceptionalism. And on China, I think China, because it's the most important potentially challenge for the United States coming up. Again, to the point of like a disconnect between voters and the people that represent them. Donald Trump has talked about, out loud about reducing troop levels in South Korea. Republicans are a lot more likely when asked, in order to respond to a growing, more influential China, should we increase our troop presence in East Asia or decrease? Republicans are hawkish. They want to increase the troop presence, whereas that's at odds with their president. And Biden supporters, the majority of them want to reduce troop presences in Asia and transition allies over, enable them to take more responsibility for regional security. And one imagines that a Joe Biden, seeing who's on his transition team and the China realm, what he said about shoring up alliances might not actually calibrate downwards America's troop presence in Japan and South Korea. So that's another partisan disconnect that might depend on who's in power, who's president, and what their stated policies are. Just a quick asterisk, and sorry, I don't want to filibuster here, but public opinion can be capricious, and there's a risk in basing policy decisions like solely on what the public thinks, right? If there can be sometimes like a rally around the flag mentality where if something happened and a U.S. embassy were attacked and you introduced that to a survey respondent, there can be ways in which this kind of stereotype that American voters or survey takers are just only interested in their prosaic, self-interested concerns, the economy, their jobs, these kinds of things, healthcare. I think they oversimplify things. I think they're dismissive and elitist. But I do think it's also important to realize that, public opinion can be fickle and capricious, and to take that into consideration when you're making these policy decisions.
All right. So just picking up on some thoughts there. So, it's fascinating to me. The generational breakdown on exceptionalism is really stark in your data. It's both of you. It's sort of like a wow sort of a thing. And, I think the usual sort of, obviously is now the youngest people have grown up only after 9/11, and the United States has been at war, and the presidents have been pretty unpopular in place. And so, maybe that's just not so surprising. But what then is surprising to me is that they're also the least supportive of Donald Trump on foreign policy. And yet Donald Trump blows into town in 2016 and gets credited with pointing out all this dissatisfaction with the status quo with foreign policy, and yet that doesn't somehow include young people at all. So we sort of talk about how the older people are still think America is exceptional and sort of still buy the old stories and so on. But evidently they're the ones who made room for Donald Trump. But then the other puzzle to me is that if you look, I think all of us who study public opinion say yes, Trump tapped into some unhappiness with the consensus is fragile or so on and so forth. But if you look at support policy by policy, Trump's actual positions are almost always the minority view. So what exactly did he tap into, number one, if it wasn't actual policy beliefs? And number two, what does that say for what the next consensus might be? Because I don't, let me ask you directly, guys. Reading your reports again this morning, I would agree that there's much less support for the traditional consensus than there was previously, but I do not see a new one emerging. I don't see the outlines of that yet. I see way too much polarization out there for that. And it's not just because of Trump, in my view. I just don't see it. I mean, there's one overlapping threat on the critical threat board. That's a problem if you're talking about consensus. And yes, we all want to be engaged, but the how is the big question, and I don't see a lot of agreement on that. So what do you guys think about that? And Stephen, let me rope you into that one too.
Okay, I'm going to start. So I agree. I don't know that there is a clear path forward from the data. It'll be interesting to see what Biden puts together, given he has sort of a restorationist agenda, but yet the progressive left, is a factor, and that's where I want to connect to the younger voter. So I think what perhaps ties, I think what you were asking, Trevor, is the anti-elitist sentiment from both from Trump supporters, but also from progressive politics too. A lot of people are now pointing to, a friend of mine sent me a video of one of these shows, like the Young Turks or one of those, and they were showing an ad that was put forth by the Trump side, showing Nancy Pelosi's freezer full of a very expensive ice cream bars or something. And so saying, while you guys are all dealing with COVID, she's eating ice cream. I feel like there is, and I was just on in another panel about polarization, and people were talking about different factions among the parties now, and how some of the left and the right actually come together on this type of issue. So I think that might be something that is driving. I wouldn't say it would be a pro-Trumpian vote, but a dissatisfaction with the status quo. I do think one thing that comes out in our data is this suspicion of the international community and cooperating with other countries, and how to get over that, because you're right, Mark, that generally Americans prefer diplomacy and diplomatic solutions before moving to something that's more forceful. Republicans tend to see hard power threats and therefore favor hard power projection of US influence. So I don't, the way to get around that, to meet somewhere new is I think difficult.
Stephen, you wanna chime in here? I'm eager to hear what you have to say.
Sure. So I will more amplify Trevor's question than answer it directly, because I don't quite know the answer. But what I think his question suggests, and Dina's answer also suggests, is that we are heading for, paradoxically, a period of fluidity amidst intense and intensifying polarization. In other words, it's quite unclear where both the Republican Party and Republican voters are going to go on foreign policy over just the next 4 years, let's say, because the legacy of Trump's America First approach is contested. There are multiple ways to both embrace it and reject it, depending on what you want to do. Maybe with the exception of the question on China, which seems to be an anti-China position, seems to be a more unifying position in the Republican Party right now, which I think is unfortunate, though it's quite interesting to see the divergence between Republican voters' preferences to ramp up the U.S. military presence in the Indo-Pacific versus what President Trump himself has said, made noises about doing, not done, we should say. And on the Democratic side, to return to an earlier question, I think it's also quite unclear how things will play out when Trump leaves the White House and is no longer the central figure around which people orient themselves and take a number of policy positions. So, yes, support for alliances have increased among Democrats in over the course of the Trump administration. What does that really mean? Does that mean that Democrats actually want a more robust military presence? They want to expand NATO to Georgia or Ukraine? I'm not sure it means that. So, will we see the return of, in the 1990s, many progressives were the ones who were skeptical of NATO expansion. They connected the dots between American security commitments and military deployments and going to war. There's quite a lot of logic behind that dot connecting. Will we see the same kind of thing happen when Trump is not berating allies in a really aggressive way, and instead the Biden administration is making policy, and it may be some Republicans on Capitol Hill who are the more hawkish voices? Others may have a different view also. That is very possible. And I'm also interested to see how the question of Russia plays out, since for many Democrats, the concerns about Russia were bound up with how they viewed Trump's election in 2016 and the impropriety that the Trump campaign conducted itself with respect to Russia, the Mueller, and I don't even need to say anymore. So, will there be a kind of opportunity for a Biden administration, if they want to have a more constructive relationship with Russia? In a way, they could show leadership, or will there be, pressures from the voters who are still really animated by concern about Vladimir Putin and Russian aggression? I think that's just a question to watch really closely going forward, and see how the shifts in the parties interact. But I just want to also go back to the question about isolationism with reference to what Dina said. I'm a lot less concerned that if the United States, that sort of, especially on the Republican side, that there seems to be a concern that the only kind of international engagement some Americans want is a military kind. I understand where that comes from, but I'm a lot less concerned that the alternative to exceptionalism or American hegemony will be some sort of isolationism and general lack of concern about America's role in the world. One reason I'm not concerned is that isolationism is a myth. It just didn't exist in American history. The term, as I happen to show in my book, was invented in the 1930s and 40s to be used by one side as an epithet against another side, against people who just uniformly were for various kinds of diplomatic, commercial engagement in the world, just were opposed to U.S. military dominance and breaking with the tradition of anti-entanglement toward Europe. So, historically, it just isn't the case that, despite a very common narrative, that a lot of Americans have been deeply opposed to U.S. engagement overall, except, say, through domination, through military force. I think the problem that we have, because I don't quibble with the preferences that we find in the data, the problem that we have is that a lot of Americans are scared, and they don't think diplomacy is tough enough to deal with threats that they perceive. And, that's maybe a fair point of view if you think that those threats truly are as grave to American security as many people who advocate U.S. armed dominance claim. So my view is that if we can ratchet down some of the threat inflation, I think the problem of whether Americans actually want to be part of the world and engage in reasonable terms, I think that will kind of solve itself, at least among large, significant portions of the American electorate who might have a political effect.
Yeah. So let me ask you, one of the things that several of our audience asked questions about China and how much did the surveys dig in there. And we certainly can't answer every possible question about nuances of opinion towards China, but I will just say from the perspective of someone who operates in the foreign policy restraint community that China is seen as a potential wrecking ball to the movement toward restraint among the American public, because it appears that both Democrats and Republicans in Washington have reasons to threat inflate around the China issue, whether it's economic stuff, whether it's the sort of Belt and Road hyperbole, or whether it's China's military posture and shenanigans in the waters nearby China. And so what do you guys take from, and I thought it was kind of interesting that the surveys make it look like people have gotten more hawkish on China in the last couple of years. What do you guys, is China the new consensus in a more hawkish, aggressive America in the future?
I mean, I wonder how much it's gone. Our survey shows that, the policy toward China in 2019, nearly 60% of Americans wanted to decrease our troop presence in East Asia as a way of kind of giving China, for lack of a better phrase, some elbow room. It was 60-40, and this year it was 50-50 in an election year. Basically, equal numbers wanted to increase versus decrease American troop presence. And of course, like we gave them a forced binary choice for a reason, and we can again talk about methodology. But it does seem like the American public is getting a little bit more concerned about the rise of China. And this happens every 4 years. Like China is a perennial. I don't want to diminish the challenge that the United States faces when it comes to China's rise, but using China as a whipping boy or a scapegoat for our various problems during election season. Like we remember Mitt Romney talking about currency manipulation and Barack Obama talking about human rights way back when, and obviously the imperatives of governing are very different, and the imperatives of diplomacy and all those things are very different than they are at campaign season, where there's very little constituency for people who would be offended by or upset with Chinese voters, all 1.3 billion of them. None of them are voting in the U.S. election, right? So it's an easy target. And one wonders whether public sentiment, I talked about before about it being somewhat capricious, buys into these narratives about, a quote unquote new Cold War. Because I don't think in general, the US public perceives a threat from China. If you were to talk to them about China, they might talk about the jobs that got, shipped to China during the NAFTA era and, from the industrial Midwest and other things. They wouldn't think about, China with its one aircraft carrier, like coming to the Pacific coast and posing a threat to Los Angeles, I don't think. But the more that politicians talk about China as a kind of adversary rather than, an economic and diplomatic challenge, I think that the more we might end up talking ourselves into, and this is my concern, we might talk ourselves into a Cold War where none necessarily existed. Dina?
Yeah, we find enough. We actually have a report on exactly on this. If anyone is interested, can look on our website. But China, it is now seen as a threat by a majority of Americans, higher for Republicans, but for the first time now, it's pretty high among Democrats too. And both Democrats and Republicans are now give China the lowest rating on a thermometer scale than going back, I think, to 1986. So it's definitely seen as more threatening now. Republicans have shifted negative toward China since the past year with all the trade war and the rhetoric around that. But Democrats, over the past year have, I think, become a lot more negative because of the coronavirus, actually. A lot of surveys, a few surveys have shown that Americans think they've handled it poorly and could have possibly prevented its spread. So I think it will be interesting to see how it changes if we ever get the virus under control, but also it's unclear where the Biden administration is going to take things with China, right? We know that he has said he wants to work with allies to pressure China to make economic reforms, but like IPR issues, but I don't think we know where it's going to go beyond that for sure. So yeah, a lot could depend on it. A lot is, it could expand. Stephen, like you were saying, there is support right now for Republicans and Democrats for negotiating arms control agreements between the US and China, working with China to limit climate change, prohibiting Chinese technology companies from building communications networks in the United States, prohibiting US companies from selling sensitive high-tech products in China, and also placing sanctions on Chinese officials responsible for human rights abuses. And that also reminds me that, you know, what's going on with Hong Kong and Taiwan could also play into abuse and also to the new administration's policy. But then Republicans are more hawkish. They support a lot more restrictive things, even trying to prevent Chinese students from studying in the US or scientific exchanges. So they definitely are more hawkish on it. And then can I just take one more point that Stephen brought up on Russia? I think you're absolutely right, Stephen, that this is an opportunity to get the domestic politics out of the US-Russia relationship, because the polls do show that Democrats are don't want to cooperate with Russia now and want to limit its power, where Dems are, it's the opposite for China. But I think once the election interference can be worked over or through, it definitely could create opportunities. We especially need it for arms control agreements too right now.
Sure. All right. Sorry, Mark, to cut you off. I got to turn it back to Trita. Guys, thanks for an excellent conversation. We have a lot more to talk about, and I think maybe a couple months into the Biden administration, we should do it again. Trita, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Trevor, and thank you to all of the panelists for a wonderful conversation. Clearly, the landscape we're entering into is a really fascinating one with a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that seem to be changing faster than many people had predicted. Before I let you all go, I just want to make sure I also let you know about our next webinar that will take place in December. We're taking a bit of a break over Thanksgiving. It will be on December 9th, and it will be titled, With the Most Powerful Military on Earth, Why Can't We Win Decisively Wars That We're Engaged in? It will be a conversation with retired Colonel Danny Davis of Defense Priorities, Center for Defense Information Director Mandy Smithberger, Quincy Institute's Mark Perry, and will be moderated by Quincy's own Kelly Vlahos. For those of you who are not on our mailing list, I encourage you to go to our website, quincyinst.org, and enter your email so you get notification of all of the different events, webinars, reports, etc., that the Quincy Institute produces. So thank you so much for today, and hope to see you all in December. Thank you.
Thank you, Trita.
Thank you so much, guys. That was a great conversation. Thank you so much for doing this.